New atheism that has been at the forefront of making big waves in the West seems to be dying. So, what's happening? Well, this is a great place for you to learn more about it. Welcome to SAFT Podcast, and what a delight it is for me to have Justine Brierley back on the podcast. Justine, welcome back once again to SAFT
Oh,
Podcast.
oh, thank you for having me back on. It's lovely to speak with you again.
And actually, this would be your third time interacting with SAFT. You've been
Yeah,
on podcast first, and then you've also been a panelist at our
that's
Ideopagus
right.
conference in
Yes.
2022. And it's such a delight to have you here. And, you know, your work that we'll be getting into a bit further is concerning the rebirth of belief in God. And it's an absolutely very well done work. But I don't want to give the introduction. I want you to let the audience know what is happening. What is you are part of the unbelievable Premier Christian Radio and the show, and so it is big news that you were moving out of what has
Yeah.
been definitely something that you left a strong imprint behind. So what are you working on? What are you doing?
Well, yeah, it was about a year ago that I moved on, believe it or not, from Unbelievable. Having been at the helm of that show for 17 and a half years of starting the show and really building it up to what it became, a podcast, video, conference, books, and so on. So yeah, it was a really bittersweet goodbye to the show because I loved hosting it, bringing people together for dialogue and debate on both sides, Christians and atheists and so on. But it was just the right time for me to start to do some new things. I think I'd got to the point where I felt actually I'd done everything I needed to do with the show, and yeah, some new doors opened up, especially the new book that I recently published, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. Being able to focus on some fresh projects means some new podcasts, a new documentary podcast series based on the book, also called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. Working in the same area of apologetics, cultural apologetics, especially, but with a bit of a new focus, and yeah, just enjoying the opportunity to do something a bit different now.
Yeah, and I will be dropping a link in the description to Justin's website, his book, and also to his podcast that you must check out. I mean, there is a reason why it has 4.9-star ratings on Apple Podcasts. It is excellently well put together. The content is very well researched, and the overall editing and the auditory experience is also very well done. I would hands down say that it is by far the best podcast experience that I've listened through all these many years, and I can see
Wow,
that it's
wow,
resonated by.
that's very very high praise. Thank you. I'm thrilled to hear you that you, yeah, I'm hearing really good things from a lot of people about it. Obviously, with there are lots of podcasts to choose from today, so having your podcast rise above is a difficult thing, in a crowded market. But I was kind of inspired really by some other podcasts I'd listened to where they were really exploring that kind of documentary style, where you have a little bit more kind of variety of voices, narration, music. And to be honest, that's where I began in radio. Before I ever began the Unbelievable show, I was creating radio features and documentaries. So it's a little bit like returning to my roots in a way, and being able to just do something that's feels a little bit special, and is a bit more of a, as you say, a listening experience.
And your podcast was a big insight, a breakthrough to what's happening with new atheism. And here in India as well, we have new atheism still in sort of its early 2000 impact level. The
Mm.
arguments, the everything is resonating with what we've seen with new atheism in the early 2000. Not much has progressed.
Interesting.
And so
Mm.
on our ministry's indigenous language, Malayalam language wing, when we started off the podcast documentary sort of dialogue series, the first episode that we did was based on what was happening with new atheism across the world and the shift that we've seen with new atheism in the West. And so your podcast was a big help to us as we
Mm.
dove into it.
Mm.
So again,
Mm.
a must listen both. If you
Mm.
want to listen in Malayalam, you can check us out,
Mm.
or I'll drop a
Okay.
link to Justin's work. Now, your title of the book and the podcast is The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. Now, there's a lot of stuff to look through. Why was it surprising? Why is there a rebirth? And what does belief in God mean? All of that. But your understanding of the rebirth of belief in God, right? At what stage did you realize that that is happening? What was to you the trigger to say that there is a rebirth to the belief in God?
Well, the subtitle of the book is Why New Atheism Grew Old and Secular Thinkers Are Considering Christianity Again. And that really, in a nutshell, is the thesis of the book and the podcast, that I think we've seen the new atheism, which was very strong, you know, in the mid 2000s to maybe mid 2010s, it really has faded away in all kinds of ways. And I was noticing from the sidelines, it wasn't just that people were kind of getting bored of it, or it hadn't answered their questions, though I think it hadn't done that. But it was also internally, it kind of was fracturing for atheists between the leaders of the movement about the direction it should go, whether it should be championing, you know, women's rights, LGBT rights, and so on. Others who didn't want to go in that direction felt that was just kind of politically correct ideology, and so on. So it was an interesting time, and the whole thing kind of collapsed in on itself in it quite spectacularly in some ways. At the same time, you know, I was hosting the Unbelievable show, and we had really begun in the heyday of New Atheism, hosting a lot of those big names, you know, Christians and atheists having those big debates. But I noticed more and more as the years went on that increasingly the non-believers who came on my show were distancing themselves from that movement. And many of them were actually more open to the value of Christian faith. So one of the big claims of New Atheism was that religion was not only false, but it was harmful, you know, that we should reject it because it's poisonous, you know, it's bad for us. Whereas I was noticing more and more non-Christian thinkers, but who were saying, actually, we need something like Christianity to make sense of life. We need Christianity because it's the foundation for the moral values that we hold in the West. So this would be people like the psychologist Jordan Peterson, who really rose to fame in sort of 2017, 2018, but very much not exactly as a Christian, but as someone who was pointing people back to the value of Christianity, scripture, for the wisdom that's there, and so on. And then alongside him, you had the rise of interesting people like Tom Holland, who's a well-known historian here in the UK, hosts a best-selling, a very well-listened to podcast called The Rest is History. And again, he wrote this book, Dominion, which made the case that the West is really founded on the Judeo-Christian principles of, you know, human rights, democracy, freedom, equality, dignity, and so on, and that these come directly from Christianity. And so I was meeting more and more of these characters who were kind of aware that New Atheism had failed people, and were kind of championing some of the benefits of Christianity, even if they didn't quite believe in it themselves. So I felt this was enough to put down in a book. So I started really the process of that in 2020, starting to gather some of my thoughts and feelings about that. But yeah, around the time it got published last year, I just noticed more and more people actually talking along these lines, saying, actually, we're all kind of inherently religious, that in many ways, what you see happening on the left and the right in our culture is just another form of quasi-religion. And that actually we need something like Christianity as a better story than the ones we're being offered in those ways. And then just after the book got published, so I didn't include her story in it, but you had this amazing story of Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who was, you know, a new atheist in her time. She was a ex-Muslim from Somalia who became one of the new atheists, wrote her own best-selling kind of anti-religion book. But then just in the last couple of years has obviously been on a big journey where she's realized that secular materialism, atheism, just doesn't provide enough of foundation for the values we need in the West and for culture. And she says she has embraced Christianity, which was just an extraordinary change. And yet I saw her story being played out in lots of other ways in the book. So this was kind of where it all came from. And this is the phenomenon that I'm sort of also charting in the podcast series as well.
Yeah. And one of the things that stands out the most, I would say quite unique within this whole trajectory of thinkers moving away from New Atheism, being disenchanted with it, is the prominence of the story with it all. The importance and the leaning that they have on symbolism and cultural value and all of that impact. And to me, that seems to be what sets this sort of rebirth apart from what we saw in the 1960s when we had those Time magazine articles saying God is dead, now God is back. We would see that sort of dead and he's back to life. Again, a sort of rebirth impact. And what stands out to me is, and I wanted to hear how you would weigh in on it, is the difference is this emphasis on the story, that Christianity has a story to offer, that God is not just someone who is the conclusion of, as Dr. Craig would say, not just the conclusion of a syllogism, but he is the living God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so is that the key distinction between the rebirth that we saw in the 1960s, 70s to what we're seeing here in with new atheism?
Yes, I think so. I think, as you say, there was that famous Time magazine article,
Mm,
"Is God Dead?" And then, you had the kind of the opposite come through. And we have seen a rebirth, I think, in Christian, if you like, philosophy and so on over the last few decades and everything. So I think there's been a kind of an academic rebirth, and that's true as well in biblical scholarship. I think there's been a really strong recovery of the Jewish Jesus and the
mm,
historicity of the gospel. So I think there's been a lot going on in academia, but to some extent that hasn't been reflected in the culture, which really from the 1950s, certainly in the West,
yeah.
has been on a trajectory downwards in terms of overall church going, religiosity, and so on. So everyone who's pointing at the actual kind of, figures like that would say, no, Christianity is kind of disappearing in the West. Um, so what I'm identifying is, I think, is more at a public level, a kind of rebirth, if you like, of belief in God. I should say as well, by the way, that this is my book really focuses on the West,
Mm, yeah.
America, Europe, Australia, so on. There is, of course, has been an ongoing actual revival, really, or spread of Christianity in huge numbers in other
Mm,
parts of the world, Africa, China, South America. So when we say the church is in decline, I'm speaking really only of the West.
mm,
Um, but having said that, I've noticed in the West this change in the atmosphere. Now, this doesn't. I don't think this yet means that we're seeing a kind of a big upturn in
yeah.
church going or
Yeah.
anything like that. What I'm kind of really describing is what I've described as a turning of the tide, where I'm just seeing a lot more dissatisfaction with that atheist materialist story of
Mm, mm,
reality, and people starting to open themselves up again to the Christian story. And I think you're absolutely right that it is less a kind of philosophical, academic kind of
mm,
rebirth. It is about people looking for a story to make sense of their lives. And my thesis simply is that we need a story to live in.
mm,
And that with the loss of the Christian story, it's taken a few generations, but we're now seeing some of the effects of losing a story which gave people their identity, their purpose, their meaning. And
yeah.
now people are searching in all kinds of other places to find that purpose and identity and meaning. But they're often searching, I think, in the wrong places. They're looking to find it
Mm,
in kind of the progressive ideologies of the left. They're looking for it in political mythologies of the right. They're looking for a story to make sense of life. But the problem is these stories are also different, that
mm, yeah.
they create the culture
Yeah.
wars, and the society starts to pull itself apart. So I am sensing that people are kind of becoming weary and tired of this constant search for meaning. I think this produces the mental health crisis,
Mm,
and so I think it's an amazing opportunity for Christians to now be able to tell their story again. And
mm,
I'm seeing some amazing stories of people who are embracing Christianity, adult converts who you are the last people often you would expect, but who have
mm,
kind of just found that the secular humanist story, as I say, just does not make sense anymore. It doesn't. It's not enough. So then you have an Ayaan Hirsi Ali again,
yeah.
an extraordinary story, but it's absolutely because she needed something more than the atheist story could offer her.
Yeah, and about the point that you mentioned about it's new call to Christians to step up and share the story, right? And it would, and right now there's a lot of points coming to my mind. The way C.S. Lewis would engage with it, his version of presenting Christianity and as such, and I can't but help call to mind what Alistair McGrath advances in his work in the narrative apologetics, and so that's coming to my mind. Do you think that given what we're seeing in the West, this disenchantment with new atheism and people's yearning for a story, yearning for these significance and this meaning as such, do you think within the field of apologetics also there's going to be a shake-up, a recalibration of sort, where we need to now be oriented more towards a narrative apologetics, story conveying version of apologetics, or do you think the typical evidential, philosophical, purely rational, I'm not saying it's not the other version is not rational, but the
Mm-hmm.
very analytical version would still do the job?
I think that's a great question. And I think there is still always going to be a place for the
Mm,
evidential, rational, approach. There's a lot of people who are just wired that way. I think the difference for me is the way I put it in the book is that I think we are increasingly going to need to start in the imaginative sphere, though,
Mm.
in that narrative sphere, because I think most people don't necessarily start at a kind of purely logical level. Most
Yeah.
people these days, I don't think, are simply asking, does God exist, or give me evidence for the resurrection.
Mm.
I think they're a long way from that, because we live in a very post-Christian culture. I think it's, those might have been questions when you were kind of, Christianity was still a going concern. It was still kind of the main story in town, and you were kind of trying to convince people that it still made sense to believe in it. But I think now, there are so many options on the table for people that I think you have to start where they are. And what I've noticed is a lot of the secular thinkers who are kind of turning people back to the Christian story. They're not doing it through a philosophical argument or anything like that. They're kind of appealing to their sense of of a desire for something more, for transcendence, for a story to make sense of their life. I see this with Jordan Peterson, especially. Why do thousands of young men turn up for his
Yeah.
lectures, for his YouTube channel? I think it's because he is allowing them to explore what it means to be human, how to be a man in the 21st century. I think there's a kind of an identity crisis in many ways among men in the West, because the traditional kind of identity of maleness is being questioned in all kinds of ways by the transgender movement, by feminism, by lots of things. And
Yeah.
I think it's left a lot of young men very confused. They don't know how they're supposed to act. They're being told one thing often in one place and something else in another place. And I think when Jordan Peterson came along and started to sort of just kind of almost as a father figure, a wise kind of older father figure to some of these young guys who were very lost, I think, it was really appealing. It kind of gave them a sense that yeah, they needed to buck themselves up. They needed to, take on some responsibility. That it kind of, and I just wonder if we need to understand that the reason that Jordan Peterson has been so popular and actually been turning people back towards Christianity is because he's kind of helped them to see themselves as part of something bigger. That there's kind of a meaning for their life, that they were made for something. And so I think the church needs to be doing this, and apologists need to be asking, what are the questions people are actually asking right now? It may not be the question, does God exist? But it might be the question, who am I supposed to be in a world with so many options? Okay. Is there a story that can kind of make sense of who I am as a person? And I just think, yeah, it's time to tell that story. It's time to come alongside people who are going through this meaning crisis, this identity crisis. And once you kind of show them why they would want this story to be true, if you kind of do that narrative, imaginative thing, then you may well need the traditional tools of apologetics, evidences to show them that it is true. But as you hinted earlier, C.S. Lewis was a great example of doing this, where he made you wish that there was a place called Narnia, a place of justice ruled by this wise but not tame lion, full of adventure, the fight for truth and beauty. And then he kind of said, well, actually, maybe that place really does exist. Maybe that's what life is actually about. And then he gave people actual evidences, through his more traditional apologetics works like The Problem of Pain and Mere Christianity. So I think we've got to do both, but we often need to start actually where people are with that imagination and that meaning that they're looking for.
Yeah, that's absolutely spot on. And you mentioned about the impact that Jordan Peterson and Tom Holland are having at the secular academic level among high-profile individuals. With, for example, the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship is an excellent case in point of how Christian thought leaders are coming in the West to shake things up. Now, one of the things that was striking me recurringly was when we look at the Christianity that Jordan Peterson and the others are embracing, it comes off as that they are embracing a cultural Christian version, and not a full-on embracing of the gospel. Now, what is your assessment of what's happening there? Are they just being cultural Christians, or are you seeing an overwhelming move towards a full-on gospel embracement?
So I think this is another great question, and a lot of people were talking about this when Ayaan Hirsi Ali published her article, Why I'm a Christian. And because she talked at some length in the article about the dangers posed by fundamentalist Islam, other regimes like Russia, China, also the progressive left. And she was essentially saying we need something like
Yeah.
Christianity to act as a kind of a bulwark against those. And so a lot of people accused her of embracing Christianity for these purely cultural, political reasons. And I understand that, because obviously that has been a motivating factor in her journey. But at the same time, if you read the article carefully, you'll see that she also talks about the fact that she couldn't find the meaning she was looking for on an atheist worldview. It did not make sense of life for her. And if you watch some of the interviews she's done subsequently, she's talked about her own personal spiritual journey, feeling spiritually bankrupt, and eventually coming to the point where she persuaded herself, well, maybe I need to take a second look at Christianity, jump into that story. And so she's obviously on a journey. And I think it's a bit premature for Christians to say, well, she's not a real Christian, or for atheists to say that, because everyone is going to come to faith in different ways. There's going to be all kinds of mixed motives for why people eventually end up there. So I'm not prepared to kind of dismiss people, even if there is obviously a cultural, political dimension to their search. The same goes for Jordan Peterson. I think, when I had him on my show, I asked him more or less a direct question of, do you actually believe in God? And he did his usual thing of, well, it depends what you mean by God. And that can be frustrating, I think, for Christians, because they want a straight answer one way or the other. But actually, I think for him, it's obviously I think he doesn't want to get caught in a trap of just treating it like any other scientific, philosophical question. He needs to have a way of engaging with God that is more than just, I think, a kind of a set of premises, if you like. And so I don't want to be judge and jury over where he's at with his journey. What I do know is that I've certainly seen him in some interviews get very emotional about the person of Jesus. There's one particular conversation he had with Jonathan Peugeot where he talks about Jesus being this meeting place between the world of myth and imagination and the kind of objective world of history and fact, if you like, and that perhaps just in this one instance they really met in that person, and that's a very C.S. Lewis kind of journey, that he's describing there, if that's the one he's going on. Obviously, in the end, I don't think if it remains just a kind of useful fiction for people, if it's just about, asserting some kind of power and the values and so on, then of course it's deficient. It's not Christianity. It's just a political tool or a culturally useful thing. And I think that if that's all the movement is, it will fade away. It won't have any power. But I've seen enough evidence that actually there's some people who are maybe in that place who are just treating it like we need something like Christianity for cult reasons. But I also see a lot of people who are kind of wavering on the edge of jumping in. It's almost like they need somehow the intellectual permission to kind of say yes to this. And I also see people who have jumped in, so I tell a number of stories in the book and in the podcast of people who have said yes to this, who have jumped in. And yes, there's certainly going to be cultural and political kind of aspect to that, but I think they've genuinely realized they need God, they need Jesus to make sense of life. And so I'm very thankful for that, because I think it's a mixture, is what I'm saying. And we will see, what comes out in the end in terms of those who are willing to surrender themselves to it, and those maybe who aren't.
Yeah, and so there's that one point that was coming to my mind, and we have around 20 minutes left. So, I mean, there's a lot of points to touch on. But one thing that's striking to me is when New Atheism came onto the scene. I mean, they came with a bang. Like they were answering a question that people were asking at that time. The 9/11 was fresh in people's mind, and there was a question about what has religion got to do with this? Why do we need religion? And they were also offering an alternative. They were pitching science and materialism and a naturalistic understanding of the world and evidences and rationality. It was not just chipping away against what people cherished and held with Christianity and with institutional religion, but they were also trying to offer an alternative. So where exactly has New Atheism failed? I mean, where have they failed to deliver in their promise? What is your review of the situation?
Yeah. Another good question. I think what New Atheism held as being the answer for people was science, really, science and reason, let's say. that with those two tools, we could work out everything about the world, and we could kind of create a culture of harmony, reason. Even people like Sam Harris, writing something like The Moral Landscape, was essentially writing the way in which he believes science can basically determine what is ethical, what is moral.
Yeah.
And so I think there was this sense that, we discovered this amazing thing called science, and that was going to answer all our questions, not just the how of the world, of how the heavens move, but also the why, what we're here for, and it will give us our kind of purpose and so on. And I would say, in a way, there was almost a quasi-religious aspect to the New Atheist movement in that way, because it was almost like there was a worship almost, I would say, of science. And the creed was this kind of materialist creed that all that exists is matter, emotion, and that everything is purely a result of, eons of time, chance, and so on. So it was a kind of, it was almost a faith, in it. But I think the problem is it very quickly became apparent that wasn't enough for people. You can certainly, science is good for some things, but it's not going to give you your purpose for life. It's just not the tool for doing that. And I just think a lot of people quickly realized that actually all that the New Atheists really had done was tear God down. They hadn't erected anything fulfilling or meaningful in God's place. There were a few attempts, to do kind of, humanism is an attempt to kind of have a kind of an ethical system that kind of gives people a sense of what they're here for, what they should be doing. But if I'm perfectly honest, I think humanism is really just a kind of copy of Christianity with the God bits trying to be stripped out. But foundationally, it's still essentially human ethics, Christian ethics, sort of, its new garb. Likewise, there were sort of attempts to do kind of versions of church that were atheist in nature, the atheist church and so on. But again, I think it was fun for a while for some people, but I don't think that can really last unless there's something truly meaningful at the center of it. So I just think, for all those reasons, it quickly became apparent that this was not going to happen. And the fact is, we're some 15 or 20 years on from the kind of height of the New Atheism, and we're living in a culture which is tearing itself apart in so many ways, where the more, it would appear, the more technology, the more science we have at our fingertips, the less we seem to be able to actually create a future in which we're happy and prosperous, because we're very good at inventing things which ultimately we end up, abusing and, using to hurt each other. So I think people are just realizing that we need something beyond ourselves. We can't, we aren't the master. We can't be the masters of our destiny. Science is great for some things, but it's not enough. That's what I sense.
Yeah, and I think it's that same clash that is coming to India as well, especially within our context, when New Atheism is still holding its fort, like it did in the US, in the West, in the early 2000s. That the breaking point of New Atheism in India and in our region is going to come at the altar of the identity crisis. That's where it's going to make or break, because even in India, we're seeing this huge flood of pride movements and allies stepping up for the LGBTQ movement and sexual identity and orientation, everything replicating what's happening in the West right now. And within the New Atheist movement also, we're seeing some of its forefront speakers mimicking or mirroring what Richard Dawkins does. Like, there are some huge fans, so they adopt his exact stance on these issues. They speak out. They're not fans of transgender movement, but we're also seeing atheist vocal speakers, people who have disconnected themselves from religion, who are in the public sphere, who are immediately resonated to be atheist by the common audience, who are avid supporters of the LGBTQ movement and gender ideology and gender sexuality, all of that. And I think that same trajectory is also going to inevitably come to India as well, where New Atheism has got no story to offer, like you said, right? They go about explaining the hows, but the why still remains unexplained. And Christianity has that advantage. We are able to speak to both the mind and the heart, the analytics and the heart of the individual who's listening in. Now, along that lines, as I mentioned about the change in sexual identity and all of that, we're also seeing some of these public speakers, public thinkers, who are changing their mind on some very unique positions on sexual identity and spirituality in general. Like Jordan Peterson was an example. In your podcast, you talk about Louis Perry, who's who has changed her perspective on what sexuality has to be. And we see speakers coming out in favor of heterosexual monogamous relationships, which has been for centuries a uniquely Judeo-Christian position.
Mm. Mm.
So, do you think that sort of a shift, right? Not specifically on the God question, but on these cultural issues, do you think that shift is happening because primarily they are disenchanted with what New Atheism is offering in these regards, or it's because of their direct, unique interaction with what Christianity is speaking into these areas of human life?
Yeah, well, I think Louise Perry is a fascinating example in this respect, because there you have someone who um, grew up in a non-religious household. She was basically schooled in typical kind of liberal feminism, growing up. And she kind of, that's what she imbibed. And she imbibed, the sexual ethic that goes along with that, which is very much, do what you want, be who you want to be, as long as you're not hurting anyone, you can sleep with whoever you want and everything else. So she was kind of a complete product in that sense of, 20th, 21st century sexual revolution. It was only when she began working in a rape crisis center that she started to change her opinion. And a lot of the things she had kind of been taught in kind of feminist theory and things didn't seem to add up, because she
Right.
recognized actually that the women she was dealing with, they had very specific needs as women, that were different to the men, that they were kind of in many ways victims so often of the way in which sex was treated, between men and women in the 21st century. She went on to write a book called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, where really just not from a Christian perspective, just from a purely socio-evolutionary perspective, she wrote about all the ways in which the sexual revolution really was good for men, in the sense that they had the freedom they wanted, but it was actually really bad for women's interests, because women have, a huge burden to bear when it comes to obviously the possibility of getting pregnant and everything else, but also just a very different psychologically to men in terms of actually what gives them a sense of stability and everything else. And she just came to the conclusion that in the end, there was something that had been basically good for kind of constraining male sexuality and enabling women to have a certain, and children to have a certain amount of safety. And that was, as you say, monogamous marriage. And so it kind of came as a surprise to her. And what she found in the process was that a lot of what she had come to just through her own research and intellectual journey happened to perfectly fit the Christian faith, and that actually there was this strong overlap, this strong mapping. And she realized that actually more even than that, she realized the way in which the Christian faith itself had kind of been the catalyst for so
Right.
much of
Yeah.
the progress in the West, especially in the way in which it enabled flourishing because of this family unit that it so strongly molded. So she's a really interesting example of someone who's definitely gone on that intellectual journey, and someone who actually I think is very close to becoming a Christian herself, because of the way these things have all come together in her life. Now, is she just a kind of an unusual example? Not necessarily, because I think what she's tapped into is a real dissatisfaction in our culture with the outcomes of the sexual revolution. She's realized that all that the sexual revolution has done is basically create a whole generation of kind of porn addicted young men, women and men who are completely broken, family units that have, been dissolved by this thing. And it's because we essentially decided, hey, we don't need the constraints of,
Yeah.
fuddy-duddy
Yeah.
Christian morality. And I'm surprised to see, even among a fairly younger generation, a not insignificant number of people who are kind of cottoning onto this and realizing we've been sold a lie here, and are returning to quite traditional values, who are actually, you know, kind of taking Christianity seriously again in terms of that sexual ethic and so on. Now, I don't know where that'll go exactly. I think, and you are kind of pushing against a huge oncoming tide when it comes to that stuff. But I do find it really interesting that even in that area, that it feels like it's possible to defend what at one point seemed almost indefensible, this idea of monogamous heterosexual marriage. So yeah, so I think we are seeing something of a change in that area.
Yeah, and that pushback against, like from within the non-Christian fold, that pushback against the idea of sexual revolution is also something very unique about human life. That we are pushing back against that which we believe to be truly liberating and empowering for humans. That's how it was peddled to women and men that the sexual evolution is liberating and empowering. But liberation and empowerment must happen within its confines for it to be
Yeah.
safeguarded.
Yeah. Yeah. I think people are realizing that just pushing the freedom lever doesn't necessarily give you a fulfilled life. It's a simple kind of analogy, but I think the problem is that in most things in life, if you just let people go completely free, you won't enjoy life. Like if you have a football game and you just say, well, you guys make up the rules, anyone can decide how this game gets played. No one's going to enjoy that game, because actually the only reason you enjoy a game of football is because everybody understands the rules and obeys them. And if they don't, they get, given a red card by the referee. So that you have to have a certain amount of constraint in life to be able to live life in a way that is fulfilling. And I think I think they're starting to realize that actually, while it had its excesses, and there were lots of things that Christendom did wrong in terms of the way it maybe loaded people with shame when it came to these kinds of things, there was also to swing in completely the other direction and say, we're going to get rid of all the constraints. You don't know what you're opening up. You don't realize what the results of that are going to be. And I think we're now starting to realize just what those results are. So I think we're starting to see the pendulum maybe start to swing back again.
Yeah. Now we're coming to the last bit of the podcast, and I know time flew by really well. So I have around 10 minutes to squeeze in two
That's
really
fine.
pressing questions. Now in your podcast, you mentioned about the upcoming refugee crisis. Now in today's political world, refugee crisis has a lot of political connotations to it, a lot of international border connotation as such. But you are talking about something else. What is the refugee crisis that you are foreseeing is coming up, and most importantly, what ought churches do to recalibrate themselves that they are ready for the challenge that's coming?
Well, the refugees I was specifically speaking of were metaphorical refugees, but refugees from what I call the meaning crisis. And the meaning crisis is, I think, this moment we're living through in our culture, which, as I said, is a point where people need a story to live by, but the stories that they've been telling themselves in terms of whether it be, sexual identities, political causes, whatever, they're not enough. They are leaving us, unfulfilled. These empty promises that if you do this, if you believe in this, you'll find the true thing. They turn out to be idols, basically. And I think people, I guess I'm just seeing enough people who are now opening themselves up to the possibility that Christianity may be the story they were looking for all along. People who maybe are experiencing the mental health crisis as well, because it's for especially for young people, I think it's a huge burden to put on them to basically invent themselves from scratch. And I think we're going to start to see young people looking for a story to make sense of their life that's maybe older, more ancient, that that has these roots that the Christian story has. And so I think this is a tremendous opportunity for the church, because I think as people are let down by the things that aren't making sense in this meaning crisis, they're going to start to look again, I think, at the Christian story. And my only question for the church is it ready? To receive these, what I call refugees of the meaning crisis? Because sadly, I think the church is often so busy with infighting, with, kind of arguing about its own things, sometimes just with all the sad scandals and things that sometimes dominate church and everything. I sometimes think we miss the opportunities that are in front of us. And for me, I just want the church to be ready to see what's happening, and to rise above the culture wars, not to kind of just be one more clanging cymbal in these culture wars, but to actually be able to meet these people who are looking for a story to make sense of life, and to show them there is a better story.
Yeah, absolutely. And the last thing I want to get your thoughts on is, when we see this breakdown of church, I think that may not be a right word, but this sort of statistic reduction in church attendance, the spike in secularist thought, the spike in the nuns category, people who have no affiliation with religion or spirituality or anything of that sort. It's always thrown against our face as Christians and said, well, look at what's happening in the West. The pews are empty, churches are turning into bars. Church and religion and Christianity is on the decline in the West. Now, what we're seeing with what you're drawing out with your work is the shift within the new atheist thinkers predominantly, or people who were highly involved with new atheist thought, and how that shift is happening. But do you foresee in the near future, and this may be too big of of an analysis or forecast to make, but do you foresee some sort of a refilling of the pews, in some sense, bars turning back into churches, where this is seeping into the masses, and all those who left the church because of new atheism coming back into the pews, or is this purely going to be relegated to just the public thinkers and public speakers?
Yeah, it's another good question. My prayer is that it will result in a revival, to put
Yeah.
it simply, that actually we will see people becoming the church again. Now, that's not to say that every version of the church that currently exists will necessarily be revived. I think
Yeah.
sometimes things do have to die off before new things get born. I think there are certain forms of church that probably are no longer fit for purpose, which have kind of failed to engage the culture, or that have become and now look so much like the culture that they no longer kind of have any appeal. So it's not that, but I do believe, just as a fact of faith, really, that God is not finished with the church, and that
Yeah.
the church will be ultimately the thing that God uses to bring his purposes on earth. Now, will it be this particular moment, this particular kind of rebirth that I'm talking about, where that happens? I don't know for sure. But I think there are some interesting things. We know that obviously the graph has been going down, down, down in the West when it comes to religious attendance and so on. But there are some interesting kind of anomalies. So there are parts of the church in the UK which are actually growing, and those tend to be the parts where there really is the kind of the most the strongest kind of belief in the supernatural, in a way. It's often in the Pentecostal movement. It's often in the it's in parts of or in parts of the church where it's really different to the culture, like the very high Anglo-Catholic churches are, for
Yeah.
instance, not doing too badly. But the other thing is, among a younger generation, I think I've seen statistics suggesting that there's actually an upturn in belief in an openness to God, to spirituality, that is actually not there among a slightly older generation. And one really interesting statistic I bumped into is in Finland, there's been a report that among young men, especially, so this is, I think, something like 18 to 29-year-olds, something, there's been a more than doubling of church attendance, professed belief in God, prayer among that age group. I think it was between 2011 and 2019, something like that. And that I find really interesting, because that's very unusual, that particular demographic, over more than doubling in Finland. Now, that could just be a complete anomaly. Who knows? But or it might be something else. It might be suggesting that actually there is something stirring, and who knows where it will land. So I'm not a good prophet. I don't know exactly what this will mean. My hope and prayer is that, yes, that it will be some kind of reflowering of God's purposes,
Yeah.
because I just don't think people can live for very long on the secular story of reality. So my hope and prayer is that, yeah, they'll come back to the true story.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is a great place to bring a close to this fascinating conversation on the surprising rebirth of belief in God. And I hope, as you have this takeaway from the podcast, I think the key thing to keep in mind is that God is still on the move. He's still in work in this world through believers in each one of us. And it is also incumbent upon us to further what we are seeing in the academic world, among philosophical thinkers, through our lives to those around us, to show that the rebirth of a belief in God is near. Christ proclaimed that the kingdom of God is at hand. Well, as Justin pointed out, there is a rebirth of belief in God happening in the West, and I think it's also called to the church in the East also to gear up for what is coming and how to prepare, because we've got a 20 years advantage on what we're seeing in the West. What's happening in the West is taking time to come here, so we've got that
Interesting.
advantage. So I hope
Yeah.
it's a great place for us to be prepared as well.
Oh, well,
And
thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. And my prayer is that if there's anything you can learn from us, if we're ahead of the curve in some way for you guys, that you'll be able to take it and to see God move in your part of the world too.
Absolutely. Thank you, Justin. And thank you all for tuning in to this episode of the podcast. And we will catch you in the next one. Till then, take care and God bless.